Hey, you guys. So in this video, we're going to talk about costume design, sticking with our theme of thinking about all of the designers that are involved in creating a theater production. We talked about the scenic designer. Now, obviously, there has to be somebody who puts clothing on the performers. So usually, 9 times out of 10, every production has a costume designer, somebody that is fully dedicated to designing the clothing that the performers wear from head to toe. And oftentimes that includes various accessories. So it could be bags, could be hats, glasses, scarves, all of that. It all kind of goes together. Now, of course, the costume designer and the scenic designer have to stay in close contact because they don't want to be creating two completely separate worlds, right? You wouldn't want to have a very sleek, modern set and then have people walking in Victorian era costumes, right? That would be a real disjunction in the storytelling, unless that's what the director wants to do, sort of shock the audience for some reason. But most of the time, the director, as we've talked about before, is seeking some kind of unity in their production. And so their concept or their concept statement helps the scenic designer and the costume designer stay in the same world. And so if a director has a concept that is a period piece, that means that the scenic designer knows that they need to make sure that their set reflects that particular period, that time and place. Let's say it's a classic Shakespeare play set in the end of the 16th century in London. And so the scenic designer chooses those kinds of elements, and then the costume designer tries to design costumes from that era. That would make a lot of sense. So what we're going to talk about today is quickly is the process that the costume designer goes through in order to develop their ideas, some of the organizational skills that they need in order to make sure that they cover everybody that's in the play. And then at the very end, I'll include a video from the National Theatre in London, which is a big, well-resourced theatre. And they'll talk about over the last 50 years or so that they have been producing seasons of plays. They'll talk about how they have done costume design. And you'll hear from a number of costume designers and then some of the other roles that are involved in costume design, including the people that build the costumes, which are often called stitchers, and other assistants that work with the costume designer. Because sometimes in a well-resourced theater, the costume designer doesn't actually ever touch a sewing machine or a fabric. They're just actually drawing the pictures and deciding what these costumes should look like and feel like, and then assistants and stitchers and other technicians, craftspeople, are actually the ones that are building the costumes themselves. But let's jump into some images in this little slideshow, and then at the very end, we'll get to that video of the National Theatre. Okay, so the costume designer, their entire process, and then the product that they arrive at. So the very first step that the costume designer is going to take is reading the play, just like we talked about that with the director and the scenic designer. Costume designer also hopefully reads the play. The play itself is going to tell them almost everything they need to know about the things that they're going to need, the kinds of clothing that the actors are going to wear. Now, the director's production concept is going to give them the time and the place, if that isn't indicated in the play. But the play itself at least is going to tell them roughly how many characters there are and how many costumes each character wears, to give them a whole landscape of all of the costumes that an actor that all of the costumes in the entire production. Now, not every theater production has a script because it might have been created by the company or by the director. And so the costume designer sometimes is in a position where they need to be really flexible, and they need to be able to be a part of that creation process. They might even create a costume or a costume design, which gives the director a new idea for a whole other storyline. But in traditional theater, the costume designer is going to be given a script, and they're going to start with a script, a play text, and they're going to analyze that script. They're going to analyze the world of the play. They're going to look at the plot structure. They're going to look at all the different locations in which this play takes place. They're going to look at the time and place in which this production of this play needs to take place, because that will affect the costume design. They're going to look at practical things like, is there a bunch of dancing, or is there a bunch of fighting? Is there a bunch of rolling around on the floor? If so, everybody can't be in ball gowns, right? So there's so many different things that a costume designer has to take into account when designing the costumes for a production. And one thing that most costume designers, most good costume designers will do is they'll create a costume plot, what's called a costume plot. They will make a column of every single performer and the characters that they play, and they'll basically go through the entire script, the play, and they will figure out who is on stage and when are they on stage, and what costume are they wearing when they're on stage, or what kind of costume do they need. Now, sometimes costume designers will start by making an initial costume plot, so they have a sense of how many costumes they're going to have to build, how many of them they might already have in storage, how many of them they might just buy. Every costume designer and every costume shop works a bit differently, but one of the first things they'll do is figure out everything that they need, right? What's the grand scope, so that they can budget, so that they can tell the director yes or no in certain instances, and for lots of other reasons, mainly just to stay organized and figure out, can I even give this actor a different costume for this other scene, or are they not going to have enough time to change? One of the fun things that we see costume designers thinking about in terms of constraints on productions are quick changes. So an actor might leave the stage, and then there's a passage of time, and they re-enter and they're supposed to be in different clothes, or an actor leaves the stage as one character and then re-enters later on as a different character, and so they'll actually might need to change their entire costume within 10 seconds. Can actually be a pretty fun thing to see happen backstage. An actor walks off stage as one character, and then there's a whole team of people waiting for them in the wings, and they just put their arms up and they tear their costume off and put a new one on them. So costume designers always have to be thinking about, okay, is this for a quick change? If it is, then I might need to use Velcro. I might need to alter the costume in some way so that it can be taken off or put on very quickly and easily. So what we'll do throughout the rest of this slideshow is just look at some of the next steps that a costume designer will take in actually designing the costumes. Costume designers are designers. They're not necessarily craftspeople, so they're not necessarily the ones actually building the costumes. Oftentimes costume designers have teams of stitchers and other people that come in and actually do the construction part. Same thing with scenic designers. Most scenic designers don't have to build the set that they design. Now here at CCVC, our scenic designers, more often than not, pretty much always, are also the technical director, or they need to build their own set. And our resident costume designer here as well also does that. He mostly builds his own pieces, or he buys them, or he rents them, or he's able to pull them from a storage space, which over 30 years he's accumulated many, many costumes. So one of the next main things that a costume designer is going to do is start doing some research. The director is going to say, okay, this is my concept, and The designer is going to take everything they learned from reading the script over and over and over again, and they're going to start putting together a little collage, or what are often called inspiration boards. They might do it just for the whole production, or they might break it into characters like you see in this image here. Now, they might do kind of the classic cut up magazines and make collages, print stuff off from the internet, photographs, artwork, drawings, images from fashion magazines are a popular place for costume designers to look for inspiration. Now, sometimes they'll do it physically, and they'll just bring in a board like this to the director, to a design meeting. And what's becoming more and more common in this digital age is for costume designers to use various online or digital platforms to create inspiration boards or inspiration images. One of the most popular platforms is Pinterest, if you're familiar with it. Costume designers will create different pin boards for a production or for every character in the production and share that with the director. The director can make notes. Sometimes they'll even give the director access. The director can pin different things up that they think is cool to give the costume designer an idea. And that's really popular for when directors and costume designers are actually living and working in different cities at the time that they're collaborating. Here's another example of a pin, an inspiration board for a whole production, The Winter's Tale, set in Russia in the 1600s. And that was probably the director's idea. The Winter's Tale was written by William Shakespeare in the early 1600s, but this particular production is set specifically in Russia. And so the costume designer is given a specific time and place, albeit an entire century, so it could look a lot different. But depending on when in the 1600s, the costume designer does their research and they figure out exactly what kind of aesthetic they're going to go for. So on this inspiration board, we see not only imagery, but we also see of costumes, but we also see various accessories like shoes or like a fan, or here in this case even just a stage prop, which you would think would be the prop designer's job, but the costume designer is obviously has a lot of stake in what the costume or what the prop designer comes up with, because it's a part of the aesthetic. It's going to be right there with the costumes. And so here we see a rifle, an example of a rifle from that era, as well as lists of descriptions of what all of these things are and for what characters they're for, or potentially for. We also see that there are fabric swatches here so that the director can touch the different costumes, fabrics, to get a sense of what those fabrics would feel like. I really like that as a director. I'm real tactile and I like to feel costumes, get a sense of kind of the emotional landscape that they seem to evoke. Because even if an audience can't touch a costume, they can see what it would feel like if they could. So after sharing some of their inspiration, some of their ideas with the director, the costume designer, the director will eventually say, yeah, I really like all of this stuff, or yeah, I like these elements. Could we have more of that and less of that? And get more and more specific until they say, okay, go ahead and draw me some pictures. So at that next design meeting, when the costume designer comes with some sketches based on their conversations with the director and based on all of their research, they'll have specific sketches for specific characters, hopefully. As you can see, these costume designers are really good sketch artists. They are skilled at drawing to-scale figures. It really helps the director have a good, solid sense of what this costume will actually look like on a body. Here on the far right, you see this is actually a design for the character of Teach in David Mamet's American Buffalo, which takes place in the 70s or 80s. So there's a specific time period. He's a specific kind of guy, kind of character. And as you can see here, the costume designer has included some notes alongside the sketch to give the director a sense of what these materials are, what kind of clothing, what kind of costume piece it is, what kind of jacket it is, because oftentimes these different kinds of jackets or shirts or pants or shoes or whatever have a specific name, and that way the director will have a sense of what that choice is. So here's some more sketches for some children characters. Here on the far right, we see that the costume designer is really just concerned with the director getting a sense of what that ball gown would look like on the actor's body. That drawing, in the sketch, the actor doesn't even have a head or hands, but at least we get a sense of what that dress looks like. And so costume designers in their drawings, their sketches will actually sometimes just focus on the costume piece that they're thinking about here and that they want the director to focus on, rather than giving us the whole picture like we saw in the last one. We see some notes, we see the character's name, we see for what act this costume is for that character. Here we have a bit more of a complete picture in the middle of a whole costume idea. And then on the far right, you see that what's being highlighted here is just this one piece, this little kind of tutu looking thing with almost like a corset top. And then we can see that piece being highlighted on this drawing. We get a bit of a hair design here as well. But more or less what we're focusing on is what this character is wearing on their torso and midsection. So again, some sketches, some descriptions, a character's name, some descriptions. This number 16A probably refers to an act and a scene from the play. After creating those sketches, the director might say, okay, I really like this, I don't like this, keep moving in this direction, and bring me some color renderings. And a rendering is really just what the final product is going to look like. It's a two-dimensional version of what that costume is going to look like. Some color renderings are really, really realistic and exacted. Others are more creative and artistic, but they give a real full and solid sense of what that costume design is actually going to look like on a human form. And here we see that the costume designer took some of their sketches, a profile and a front and a back, and then added watercolor to kind of capture the feeling and the color of the costume. I think that's a really beautiful, just visual piece here. Again, we have some more color renderings with some more notes. We see here that Antipholus of Ephesus from William Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is going to have a ponytail. These two characters actually are identical twins in the play, but as we can see, they've clearly cast two actors that don't necessarily look completely alike, but you can see some of those similarities in the boots and the pants between these characters. This guy maybe is, the costume designer is trying to capture that the Antipholus of Syracuse is a little more ruffled, maybe a little more suave, whereas Antipholus of Ephesus with his buttoned up tie and his sort of buttonhole chain here is a little more reserved. So costume designers can really, really capture a character's essence in ways that other designers can't necessarily. Other designers like set designers and lighting designers and sound designers are really thinking about the overall landscape of the play. And costume designers are too, but costume designers really get to get into the character's world. And so costume designers are often collaborating closely with actors. You know, they want the actors to help them figure out what kinds of accessories, what kinds of pieces they feel good in as their character, because nobody knows the character better than the actor playing the character. You'll see some of that in the video toward the end here. Here's another example of a whole cast of characters in color rendering. What's interesting here is that they all have the same body type, which is probably not the case in real life, but in the cast. But this is just a way for a costume designer to express their overall aesthetic in a production. Here are three different designs of different color renderings from different productions of Hamlet. We can see that they all kind of come from different periods. This one on the far right looking a bit like kind of a medieval costume design. One in the middle that's a bit more classically Elizabethan from Shakespeare's time. And then finally on the far right, kind of this contemporary or more modern kind of James Dean-esque sort of drawing or rendering of Hamlet. And again, we see notes along the sides. Here's Hamlet in Hamlet, just in Act 1. So we could assume that this Hamlet has multiple costumes. And then once the director and the costume designer agree on the sketches and then the color renderings, the director will say, okay, we're good, let's pin it down and go ahead and build the things. So here we see some examples of costumes from a period production. These costumes take an incredible amount of skill just to build. They're all corseted, so they have corsets which wrap around the women's torsos. There's obviously the hair design is a big part of these costumes as well. Here's, I forget which production this is from, but it's from one of Shakespeare's history plays, one of the Richard plays, or maybe one of the Henry plays. But obviously this is not set in Elizabethan England. It's not even set in the 13th or 14th century, 15th century rather, when these Henry plays take place, because we can tell that because of the costumes. They're not from that period. They're sort of futuristic almost, specific kinds of fabrics. They're very simple. This is an image from the really famous Broadway production of The Lion King, which was based on the Disney movie. And I wanted to point these out because these are incredible costume designs. It's a really, really famous costume design play. It's all about the costumes, because the costumes are also part puppets in that production. Now with the lions in particular, here we see Scar on the left and Mufasa on the right. Those masks, or these headpieces, are weighted in such a way that when the actor leans over, the mask comes down in front of their face, and when they stand up, it rises up and sits up above the performer's head. And so we get to see the actor's face, and then when they crouch down in that aggressive physicality, the mask comes down. Here we see another use of mask, and of course, if a costume designer knows, if the director says, I know we want to use mask in this production, the costume designer is going to start there, and then they're going to build the rest of the world around that, because to use masks on every character through the whole production is a really, really significant choice. And this is from a production of, I believe, from the 1980s of Oedipus Rex, the famous Sophocles tragedy from 5th century BC Greece, and we know that the ancient Greek performers always wore full masks, and these aren't necessarily Greek masks, but they're modeled on some of those early Greek masks, and these are all hand carved wooden masks. Maybe some of them are ceramic, I'm not sure. But you can see a real collaboration between the mask makers, the costume designer, and the scenic designer. We have a really unified color palette, this sort of earth tone color palette all the way through this whole stage production. I just threw these in. I don't know what these are from, but they're very interesting because oftentimes a costume designer might play with symbolism. They might play with certain kinds of imagery to kind of capture something specific that they want to say. So if you look really closely, you can actually see that in the costume piece on the far right, it's all made up of architectural elements and architectural imagery. We have brickwork on the sleeves and on the ankles here, Roman columns on the thighs, some archway on the torso. Here on this dress in the middle, we see some kind of, there's just got a real musical kind of instrument sort of symbolism going on. We got some real bird-like kinds of qualities, some wings, or even like some reptilian scales. And then at the same time, some of these have a real militaristic kind of quality to them. So it's amazing what a costume designer can do and start making an audience member think about with some really expressionistic or symbolic choices, design choices. And then finally, here's a little shot from Hairspray, our local sensation here in Baltimore. Obviously in Hairspray, the costume designer has to at least be thinking a lot about, and maybe even beginning with, the hair design, because hair is so important in Hairspray. But I actually wanted to bring your attention to the performers in the background, because in musical theater, a costume designer is often going to be faced with a large ensemble or chorus or backup dancers and singers. And so they have to figure out some kind of unified way of costuming these characters who really maybe just represent one character or a whole group of people. And so here we see our boys in dicky bows and sweater vests and their hair combed over just so, and their khaki pants, sort of capturing that spirit of the preppy 1950s, 1960s male character.
For the past 50 years, the National Theatre has staged some of the world's most iconic theatrical productions. Whether opulent, minimal, fantastical, or realistic, costume and makeup has always played a key role. So why is it so important? And what changes have the past 50 years brought?
It's very, very important that the costume tells a story.
It sustains the illusion of the world the play needs in order to work.
Sometimes the set has to be more minimal than it used to be. So very much the costumes and the props are the things that have to tell the story about that character and the journey that that character has through the show.
Well, theatre production is about, obviously, the illusion of a place, of a life, of a dream, of something that is get replicated every night on stage. In order to do so, we have to kind of transform or help the actor. That's why we use costume, we use lighting, and therefore we need to use wigs. The connection with costume obviously is very strong, mainly because the designer, 90% of the time, the designer that is designing the costume is also designing the wigs, hair and makeup.
We have actors who play more than one character in a show. So for actually to, differentiate between those different characters that the person is playing, it's imperative really that that character is portrayed by a costume that tells part of that story.
If you have to change from a character to character under 1 minute, the easiest way is to have 2 wigs with the different styles than trying to do a different style on your hair under a minute.
We do still get designers who their way of cementing in their mind what this show requires is by doing a set of designs. But I would say the majority of designers these days prefer to work in a way that is more collaborative.
It's a dialogue with the actors as well. The actors got a lot to say as well, what he's wearing, costume and wigs.
The wonderful makeup artist here and the wonderful designer were very open to suggestions about a lot of stuff. And they were very happy for me to come up with some of the designs myself. Now, the thing with the character I play is I just use my own accent, so it's assumed that he's Irish, like I am. So we kind of had some Irish-themed tattoos on him as well. I'm becoming Bill Bones, and Bill Bones is the bloodthirstiest pirate ever to sail the seven seas. He had been around a lot of different countries and had been around a lot of different cultures, and so I wanted a kind of a tribal look to him, I suppose. Bill Bones is on stage for maybe about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, half an hour. So you've a lot to convince an audience of in a very short period of time.
And it's very much due to the creative team's influence as to how we might look at, say, a period play, as to whether we're trying to truly represent what absolutely would have been true to the period, making sure that as best we can, the lace, the accessories, the trim, everything was as accurate as we could. Or do they want a slightly more caricature look at that period of time?
Don't forget, 90% we do straight plays, we do reality plays. Therefore, what I'm creating is the realistic vision of that character. So we don't make wigs to look like wigs, we make wigs to look like human hair. It's a beautiful art of wig making, very ancient art. It takes probably an experienced wig maker, wig knotter as we call it, 40 to 45 hours to create a full wig.
We have 3 theatre spaces here at the National, and each one brings its own challenges from a point of view of how we create the costumes.
There is definitely a major difference the way you construct, the way you design wigs for a show in a big theatre like the Oliver or the Littleton, and a show with the intimacy of the Dorfman.
In the Dorfman Theatre, you could just as well have somebody wearing a costume walk by you and be inches away from you, and you're part of the action. But yet in the Olivier, you could have somebody sitting quite a long way away, yet we still need to tell that story, and the costume still needs to be able to read with that person who is sitting at the back of the circle. And the additional challenge that's been put upon us over this last couple of years is NT Live.
The way the NT Live affects my department is huge, because obviously we move in tools and we move in medium from a stage performance, we go to a recorded on high HD cameras, and the cameras go quite close, closer than what the audience will be on that particular night. And so we need to give to the audience also what they're expecting to see.
I think as a generalisation, a lot of designers used to want to create something that took you into a different world, that made you feel that these had been created especially for this play or these characters, whereas now there is much more of a feeling to have things that allow the characters and the actors to speak through, and the costumes and the clothes to almost blend into the background.
Although we are called the costume department and we're creating costumes for actors, very many designers these days refer to them as clothes. They want them to be more realistic. I think, you know, when you don't look back to just last year or the year before, and you try and take a little slice of time that goes back 10 years or 20 years and something like that, then there are things that I think have played their part in moving things forward. I think Lycra is one of those things that, you know, we now can't imagine life without Lycra in all of our everyday lives, but certainly in costume, it has revolutionised the way that we work and the way that we can use fabrics and the way that we can utilise things. Can you imagine being somebody wearing a costume that they had to move in or dance in and it didn't have stretch in it, and it was, you know, a very restrained and tight thing, and how that must change your approach to how that you move, how you stand and everything else?
One thing that hasn't changed over 50 years is that really silhouette is really, really important.
It's the silhouette that tells you what period of time you are in. What's revealed by a costume is what level in society is this person? Is the neck high? Is the neck low? Is it tight-fitting? Is it loose-fitting? So, you know, very much silhouette tells a story.
Over 50 years, the techniques have changed, the fashions have changed, and the audience expectations have changed. And although we respond to those changes, we can always lead the way as well in creating those changes. The basic essence of all of this is that we have to be able to tell the story with the costume. People have to know what the characters are trying to do. And that hasn't changed.
Now that we've gone through the whole slideshow and you've seen this video from the National Theatre, I would like you to take a few minutes, choose a character from one of the plays that we've read so far this semester, just one character. Don't need to pick the whole cast, just a single character. It could be the main character, it could be one of the smaller characters, and sketch a costume design rendering for a hypothetical production of the play. You get to do anything that you want. As long as you can explain why you're making the choice you're making, you get to do whatever you want. There's no wrong way to do this. So do this, and we'll talk about it in class. All right?